This is a true story. It's about a curious and courageous woman. It is sometimes inspiring and sometimes unbelievable. It's a story about how this daughter of a publisher became a pioneering scientist and a doctor in a time when women were barred from, not allowed to attend medical school. I first heard about this story because it was a finalist in the history category of the Colorado Book Award, which is hosted by Colorado Humanities and their Colorado Center for the Book. I turn to their list of award winners and finalists every year for great recommendations. I highly recommend it. So today we are talking to author Lydia Reeder and narrator Sara Sheckells about the book, The Cure for Women. Dr. Mary Putnam Jacobi and the challenge to Victorian medicine that changed women's lives forever. We start with why Lydia was drawn to this story.
True. Okay, just out of curiosity, can I ask you just one side question about what's in the background? Who is the portrait behind you, Lydia?
That's my grandmother as a young girl.
Beautiful that she's overlooking your space. Let's start with Lydia and talk a little bit about what drew you to Mary Putnam, where the germ for this story came from.
I thought about my great-grandmother, who was my grandmother's mother. She was a midwife in rural Missouri at the turn of the 20th century. You know, she provided really vital reproductive care because she was kind of the only healthcare provider in her rural area. And I wanted to know, she mentioned wanting to become a doctor. And I thought, well, what was life like for women in the 19th, 20th century as far as medical care went? And her life truly inspired my research. And as I read more and more, I was amazed by just the brilliance of the first women doctors who, despite being barred from all American medical schools, just found ways to get educated and credentialed. So I started out reading about all the women doctors, kind of in a sequential timeline. And then I ran across Mary Putnam Jacobi, and she was a little younger than the other first doctors. But she was truly a force of nature. Nothing stood in her way. She had an idea of what she wanted and she went for it.
Yeah, I thought one of the first things that struck me is how young she was when she gains entry into spaces that are medically based.
She was the eldest child of 11 children growing up in and around New York City. Her father was George Putnam, the publisher. So she grew up among some of the great writers and artists of New York City at that time. There was Mark Twain and Edgar Allan Poe, and I think Elizabeth Barrett Browning came to visit them once. So she knew how to talk to people from a very young age. She wanted to become a doctor and eventually convinced her father to let her go work at Elizabeth Blackwell's hospital for women and children. She was young.
Her curiosity, as you weave together her life story, she's more than just an intellectual. She is innately curious and not intimidated. She does have a courage to her that prevails through all of these snippets of stories you share.
She was taught, I don't know how she learned it, but she had great support from her father, even though he would balk at first. He really loved her. And she learned how to trust herself, which a lot of women didn't know how to do and still don't know how to do. She was so confident in herself. She was a very modern woman, I thought, for her time.
Yes, I think, Sara, I want to bring you in on that because I think that there are these curious echoes for me in things that she says or things that we find in her writings through Lydia's story that feel so modern.
Oh,
Uh,
absolutely. Absolutely. The parallels and on so many levels to what we're experiencing as women as related to healthcare systems today, whether or not we're entering the medical field ourselves as professionals. I had to stop sometimes in the reading and just be like, whoa. So in terms
yeah,
of all those
yeah,
parallels and almost how scary it could be at times, in terms of all of these advances that these women were making, both in the suffrage movement and in the medical field, and how it can feel now that we're just, coasting backwards.
yeah,
So, but really just amazing at how much intelligence these women had, because not only did they have to prove themselves, they had to prove themselves double, triple, quadruple the amount of times that we would have had to do the same today in order to gain entry into spaces and schools.
yeah. Yeah, I think you did a really lovely job of, and part of it is the gift of the story from the author, I know, but you were very, your voice for her or your interpretation felt like you understood that as if she wasn't some woman from the past. Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like you brought
Yeah,
her
yeah.
into a conversational. I really appreciated how you delivered her and the other women in the story, and even the other men. We get these glimpses of. There's a section in midway probably through the book, and there's a man, Dr. Clark, who has these theories about women's health and what's right for the care and upbringing and education of women, and it was shocking to read.
Yeah, well, her takedown of Clark was very funny. How she used her intelligence to just disprove all of his theories. And not in a insensitive or mean or cruel fashion, but just using what she knew were facts. And I remember that was a place in the text where you could infuse it with humor because the humor was there. The entirety of the subject matter is of such great personal interest to me that it was really among my most favorite reads of the past couple of years because it's a text that I would read myself with great interest. So in
Mm.
order to perform it, it just felt natural because I was really, really interested in everything that was happening and in so many of the people that were profiled.
Yes, and I think that in our work, we are, as both of you as storytellers, I mean, like, our work is collectively where we choose to shine our light, what we choose to give our talent and time to, feels even more relevant every year to me, feels even more important. And I did wonder what your personal thoughts or feelings were about literally lending your voice
Oh,
to elevating
absolutely.
and amplifying this woman's story.
Yeah. This was such a great opportunity to learn about a woman that I hadn't had prior familiarity with. Very quickly, my backstory was in undergrad, I was a women's studies minor, and my college internship was serving as a tour guide, a costumed tour guide on what was called the Boston Women's Heritage Trail, which was a feminist reinterpretation of the Freedom Trail. And I got to play the
Wow.
part of Lucy Stone, who's mentioned in the book, along with many other women. We would be telling their stories as they related to the city of Boston. So I was familiar with the Grimke sisters and the Blackwell sisters because their names popped up in our storytelling. But Mary Putnam Jacobi was someone who was newer to me. So to have the opportunity to tell this story just felt so important and vital.
Wow. That's a fabulous connection. I love that. I love that. And I did think, as I read, that Lydia, you had done this work of weaving um, a lot of different stories into our main story,
Hmm.
right? I think that's a real, I don't know, tapestry art form to take all of that information and weave it together into this. I mean, I imagine you had more than what we get total.
Oh
But
my
what was,
gosh, yes.
yeah, yeah, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
Because she was so connected. Like, we go to France with her. Uh,
Writing about her, it crossed my mind, and this is why the book has humor. I thought of her as the Forrest Gump of her time,
Ah,
because she was
that's
at
a great
the
analogy.
front lines of the Civil War, and she was
Yeah.
there during the during wartime France, and then she just experienced all these firsts among with women.
Yes.
That's why she amazed me. So looking through her timeline, I realized that this was truly a cinematic experience. In reality, her life touched so many different things, and she was so excited to just, barrel into each one of them. And in Paris, she ate it up. She loved it so much. But writing the cinematic experience, tapestry is a very good word for it, because I don't really think that you understand truly what's going on unless you do see everything.
But you had to broaden the lens pretty big
Yes.
in order to see her life and the impact of her life.
Yes, and that's why I wanted to touch on some of the different women who were also doctors at that time, to show mainly her mentors who were equally brave in their own
Yeah.
right. And I do have to say that while writing it, I had one reader write to me and say, I was just so angry. I was just so angry at the end of it. And actually more than one expressed that, and I'm so glad to get that feedback, because many times I was angry while writing it because it was so familiar today.
Yes. Yes. In the last parts of the book, you are talking about what would she think today? Like it was an interesting dichotomy actually, because in one paragraph we're like, today there are this percentage of physicians are women.
Mm-hmm.
It's over 50, right? And this percentage of women in medical schools, and these great, like what seem like these milestone successes. And then you give us like, but what would she think about the political climate of today and the loss of women's
Mm-hmm.
reproductive freedom?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I kept wondering that as I watched the political landscape and even the medical landscape. I kept wondering, what would Mary Putnam Jacobi do? Because I found her so courageous. And so in the end, I wanted to draw her back into the present. I would love to go sit down to a nice dinner with her and pick her brain, What can I do? What should I write about next? Oh my gosh, I don't know. It's almost paralyzing to a degree, but these women fought through every bit of it, and they weren't used to immediate gratification. They knew
Oh,
that what they were doing now would affect the future, and every one of them, including Mary Putnam Jacobi, all the women doctors, taught young women who were interested in medicine, and they kept it going and they expanded it. And that's another part that just really encouraged me.
that is a great nugget of wisdom, that they were not focused on immediate gratification or the immediate success of something. They were invested in the future, which is a great point.
She compared women's rights activists to bees in a hive,
Yes.
because that's what they were doing.
Yes. Focused on the collective good.
Collective, yes.
I thought one of the parts of the book when she meets her soulmate, Abraham, and you describe how the two of them believe that science and medicine are for the betterment of all. This is essential to democracy,
Mm-hmm.
which I thought was which seems common sense and universal, and yet it was in contrast to what was being pushed by Harvard or by the established decision makers.
She and Abraham Jacobi were very much alike in that they had both kind of gone through a radical youth.
Yes.
His was much more radical in Germany when democracy was pushing out the authoritarians. But during her time in Paris, she spent time with the revolutionaries. She roomed with some of them, but it confirmed her beliefs about women's equality and radical democracy and how they were kind of tied together. She was there during the siege of Paris by German troops in the aftermath when the socialists established the Paris Commune. She watched it all and sent articles back by balloons that left the city at night.
Yes.
So she immersed herself in those feminist ideals along with science. She's credited with bringing scientific medicine back to America. She worked in some of the best clinical labs under the best clinical scientists at the time. And when she got back, actually the Lancet journal credited her with bringing scientific medicine to America, which means that you test it in a laboratory and you find out what the evidence is for what you're doing. Before then, it was you mainly depended on doctors and their pathologies and, their proclamations of what you had, which was important. Doctors' assessments are very important,
Yes.
but at the same time, she brought in scientific studies to it and data-backed science. And that's where she and her husband clashed. He was, 15 years older than she was, somewhere around that. He had not been introduced to scientific medicine. He didn't believe in germs. He called it bacteria mania.
Yeah. Yes, it's so interesting today how some of the debates about how disease is spread still become something that science has to continue to step in with. The scientific method has to continue to prove itself in popular spaces and in popular opinion. I did think, I want to hop back to what you were saying about sort of globally, her influences globally, Abraham's influences globally. And Sara, I thought it was very effortless how we went from names of French things and phrasing, and it never stumbled me. As a matter of fact, I just felt like it was just a wider lens. I didn't get stuck on any of it. I thought you really beautifully she was multilingual, and I thought I could feel that in your delivery. Are you multilingual?
you.
Do you speak
I
French?
am not. So thank you. That is called acting.
Good acting, Sara.
So yes, as a fellow narrator, you know that behind the scenes there are several retakes and lots of practice in the case of
Sure.
unfamiliar terms. So
Yeah.
sometimes with other words or words in other languages, we just work with them until they sound natural and they
Feel
just
natural.
flow. So,
Yeah, it
but
did feel
the
natural.
writing also lends itself to storytelling. I tend to work with a lot of nonfiction texts, and some of them, and rightly so, are quite academic in nature. So the delivery by default, even though you try to humanize it, is still
Yes.
academic. So the writing here in The Cure for Women was such that it really did flow like a story. So it just felt natural to tell it in that fluid way.
Yeah. Were you struck? There was a part where where she's talking in the story about feminism and she runs up against anti-feminism in different ways. In America, it was like this would have been an undemure thing for a woman to be in these spaces. It wouldn't have been proper. But the French had a different take on it, but the effort was to exclude, to keep women out. But it was a funny thing that she experienced different forms
from one country to another.
Yes.
And then certainly in the case of history, or as I like to say, her story, there are so many divisions even within the suffrage movement between women of color and white women, between different ideologies, and what the intent was. Was it to get the vote? Was it to seek equality? And there were different subsets within the movement that had different goals. So sometimes they flowed together and other times they butted up against one another. So it was interesting to me, and I had some context for some of the other background stories, but to see it within the world of medicine and how she was going to always default to the side of science. But in doing so, in order to advance herself, it seemed as though she also had to adopt, not that she didn't buy into it, but that she also bought into the suffrage movement in a lot of ways, because it was also going to work to advance the other things that she wanted to put forward. So it's just very interesting how there's the group aim, the group goal, and then the individual desire to move something forward, and how they can either come together or have some conflict.
Yes, even when she comes up against eugenics, right? This Dr. Clark puts it out as something, this is, I'm worried about women. We need to not educate, because when we work on their brains, it just ruins all of their other parts.
Yeah.
Like somehow reproductive and intellect are competing for energy, right? He has this unusual, like crazy idea that becomes published and supported.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lydia, you would just pick at the surface of it and you go, oh, all of this other darkness underneath that, right?
It was, to me, it wasn't by accident, this whole movement back then to kind of stuff women back in the bottle, back in their kitchens, back in their, parlors. It was on purpose. When you bring eugenics in, the part that I write about, it talks about Darwin,
Yes.
and it was a misinterpretation of Darwin, but Darwin at the same time in his writings agreed that if white women stopped worshiping their husbands, stopped making their husbands the epitome of their existence, then the white man would shrink
Mm.
and lose their pinnacle on the evolutionary totem pole. And that was kind of what was at the base of it. Edward Clark wrote the book Sex and Education, or A Fair Chance for the Girls, and he brought Darwin in and he brought in others, but he wrote that if females perform too much brain work, their reproductive organs would shrink and they would devolve into a third gender called a gene, similar to what he called a sexless class of termites. And Mary Putnam Jacobi in her response makes fun of that, but he related it all to evolution and kind of that warped vision of eugenics. And then Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was the dean of Harvard Medical School at the time, wrote in an essay published in the Atlantic magazine, he declared that in this fight to pacify the females so that they would calmly and happily get married and reproduce, Edward Clark was the same as Abraham Lincoln in his attempt to lead the white man into a battle that they must win. So they took it very seriously. So I believe that the feminists and the suffragists and the women's movement back then understood how serious their situation was. And they backed each other up, they helped each other, even though they had these internal struggles, especially with race and class. In the end, they wanted the vote, they wanted the power, they needed it.
That's a good spot to pause in the conversation and listen to a scene from the audiobook. This is from early in Mary's life. She's a teenager. She's glimpsing through a powerful compound microscope, and in the finite, she sees something profound. This is from The Cure for Women, Dr. Mary Putnam Jacobi and the Challenge to Victorian Medicine That Changed Women's Lives Forever, by Lydia Reeder, published by Dreamscape Media, and narrated by Sara Sheckells.
Mary had likely peered through simple microscopes at school and observed the crisscrossed veins on leaves or the 8 bulging eyes of a deceased spider. But she had never looked through a powerfully adjusted compound microscope at slides of human tissue. The miniature universe that appeared before her left her speechless. The hundreds of magnified cells looked like worlds within worlds. She literally stopped breathing when she realized that she was looking at the most basic form of life. Suddenly, she was filled with a galvanizing desire to know more. In the days and weeks that followed, she spent hours analyzing specimens in the lab. She studied the periodic table of elements and pored over biology textbooks, reading Virchow's cellular theory, first proposed in 1855, that all cells came from existing cells. She realized that the cells that formed a woman's body were no different than a man's. Superficial boundaries such as those subjecting women to cloistered lives dissolved in her mind. They meant nothing. Science was freedom. She was reborn a scientist.
It's a very big story. I think that's another reason that I brought a cinematic element into it. A lot of times when women are written about, it's kind of shrunk down in books, and a lot of it comes from the man's perspective, even though it's about a woman, because they saved the man's writing, but not the women's. That's what historians have. The resources they have are from the men. Mary Putnam Jacobi wrote a lot, and her relatives and her students saved her writing, and there was a lot that I could draw from in order to tell her story. But I also read her writings, and I think it's really important to emphasize what she achieved in medical science, which was for the very first time, using the best technologies available at that time, she mapped the physiological and chemical signs of menstruation related to the actual physical changes in women's bodies. Before that, men had not touched that. They had not looked at inside the uterus much. They hadn't seen a human egg outside the uterus. They thought that women went into heat, kind of like dogs did, so that they were most fertile while they were menstruating. They had all these wrong ways of thinking. They thought that menstruation was an actual wounding, that the uterus was actually ripped apart during ovulation, and that that's why it caused a woman kind of like getting shot in the heart or something every time. So they saw it as a wounding, and Jacobi came along and said, well, no, it's just kind of like eating and digesting and your hair grows and everything else. And she was the one who came out and said, no, I think women are most fertile a couple of weeks after menstruation, not while she was menstruating. Her medical discoveries were unique and very important in the study of women's physiology and biology.
Yes, and it's not going back that far.
She was
right?
born in 1842.
Yes, so
Yeah.
we're not going back that far.
Well,
men were pretty much content to be like, we don't know.
We don't know. They were still studying Hippocrates as far as what women, women were kind of the inside out version of men. That was still kind of what was popular.
Not that many generations back.
No, and the other thing that happened at the beginning of the 19th century was that women started being widely educated. Before then, it was more important to educate the boys than the girls. So a lot of women, especially, lower class women or rural women, were illiterate. And by the time Mary Putnam Jacobi came along in the latter part of the 19th century, we had public schools. Boys and girls were being educated together. They were getting the same education. And these medical men that I write about hated that. Yes. They didn't want that to happen.
Yes, that is another important part of this, is that we are talking about just public education and how that is a great equalizer.
Yes. And how it was vital, women's suffrage and women gaining freedom, even though it took decades and decades. The more educated women became, the more they understood how much they were being held back.
Yeah.
So
that's a very good point. I'm thinking about her life as what we first talk about in terms of courage. But she was also an incredible scientist
She was
and looked at things that no one else was looking at, answered
yeah.
questions people hadn't even bothered to ask.
Oh, no.
I thought it was fascinating that she was part of a publishing family,
Hmm.
that she was, you mentioned earlier these, and we get snippets of that. Sarah reads some of that out loud, even some of these articles and things that she was writing, that she did have a way to broadcast her information and publish, partly because of her
Yes.
status in a family that was part of what we would consider a media company today. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, her father published Elizabeth Blackwell's first book. He liked Elizabeth Blackwell. He liked her idea of public health and what she talked about. So it contributed, her status contributed a lot to what she was able to do,
Yeah.
and her education.
Yeah. Sarah, when you tell people about this book, I know we get asked all the time, what's the best thing you've narrated recently, or what can I listen to that you've worked on? What is your messaging about this work? What do you tell people
Absolutely.
about it?
I mean, this is a title, The Cure for Women is a title that I myself have gifted to friends and family members who I know are like-minded and would appreciate hearing the story of a woman who has not yet had her story told in a broad or a public way. So that's something that's certainly a little thing that I can do to get that story out there just a little bit more. And I don't care how people consume it. I mean, it would be lovely for them to listen to it in audio, but
Yeah.
print, however this story reaches people's ears or eyes or however people consume writing, this is something that I think is important because it's not only, as we've alluded to earlier, Lydia does such a wonderful job of not telling just one story, although it's certainly one story. There are so many other people who are profiled within this book, some who may be familiar, others not. We hear the good, we hear the bad, we hear everything in between. I think the relationships profiled are fascinating. The relationship between Mary Putnam Jacobi and her husband, and how that changes over time, and how their ideologies really have an impact on the outcome of their relationship experience and that of their family and what happens therein. I think it was fascinating to hear about Clark and S. Weir Mitchell, and even though I had
Yes.
known to some extent about the rest cure, the connection to one of my favorite pieces of writing, Charlotte Perkin Skillman's The Yellow Wallpaper, and her experience with Mitchell, and then her eventual interaction with Mary Putnam Jacobi, was fascinating. So as disturbing as that part of the story is, it was also just amazing to put all of these little pieces, these little bits that I had heard of through the years and my education and so forth, to be able to see the larger picture behind all of that, and how impactful what these men had put forth really was, and how much it held women back, like literally physically, and that impact on our lived experience to this day. And how important it is to understand the things that happened in the 1800s and to liken them to what we might be seeing now in 2025, and to really be aware that where we're headed, if we're not cautious and wary of what's happening around us.
Yes. A cautionary tale. That is also, yes. Yes.
History
Yeah.
shows where we came from. I just want to say that I so appreciate Sarah's enthusiasm for the book. I was able to, pick Sarah. My publisher sent me a number of samples. And when I first heard her voice, I knew that she, could represent Mary Putnam Jacobi.
Yeah.
She was kind of the voice in my head when I wrote. I thought, gosh, strong and feminine, but earnest, with lots of authority. So it just made me really happy, because some of the other voices just, while they were really good, it just doesn't work. So when you find that right, it works really well. So I highly recommend listening to the book too.
Yes, a lot of people consume in audio, and I love the adjective. I love that word earnest. Actually, that's
Mhm.
as a descriptor for voice isn't necessarily something you think of right off the top of your head, but that is a great descriptor for this. There is an earnestness to the way that you've written this character
Mhm.
and the way she's delivered. I also love the Forrest Gump reference because honestly,
Charlotte Perkin Gilman, Horatio Storer, who was the vice president, the AMA vice president, and the leader of the Physicians' Crusade against abortion. He's why we're at where we are today. He's in the story. It was just fascinating to me and kind of exciting to really discover all those connections and then tie them together.
yes, I think if you enjoy a good follow the trail of breadcrumbs,
Yeah.
you will love this story. And all the people of that time, those are recognizable names, like you said, to some of us, but I think it's worth going back and looking at where is the echo coming from? Where is this language coming from today? Where are these ideas coming from? And you have laid them out. You can see them in this story, I
Oh,
think,
I
very well.
think history gives us the foundation for critical thinking.
Mm.
And if we don't see where we came from, then oh boy, we're in for it as we move ahead. And it's going to be, it's going to be kind of scary, but it was scary back then for women.
Yeah, we need some Mary Putnam Jacobis for sure.
We need a bunch, an army of them.
Yeah.
Well, I thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I do like to end, if you have a minute, I like to ask the storytellers that I have the privilege of interacting with. For you, if someone said, what is most essential? What do you think is most essential?
Oh gosh. To not give up. To,
Oh,
to, to keep going and to look at something from as many different angles as you can to find the one that feels right for you. But definitely don't give up. That's essential for me.
I love that. I love that. That's a great answer. That's a great answer. Thank you.
Yeah, that is fantastic. I would say I'll take the narrator spin on this, and I will say storytelling, specifically human storytelling, and
Mm.
how vital that is to understanding our past and where we're headed in the future. And to not rely on facsimiles, but to really go to the source, the backstory, the picture that you have on your wall, Lydia, of your grandmother, you said, like
Mm-hmm.
to think of these and how the book starts and how you're recounting a family story
Mm-hmm.
and how this really tells us something about where we've come from and what we need to take heed of moving forward, the good and the not so good, so that we can continue in a direction that is going to be beneficial for us and those who come after us.
That's really great. Give your life a cinematic touch because everything counts.
Yeah. Oh, you guys are amazing. This has been really wonderful. Thank you so much
Thank you,
for.
Teresa, for
Oh,
the invitation. This was
yes.
wonderful.
Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed getting to know author Lydia Reeder and narrator Sara Sheckells as much as I did. If you can't wait to hear more about the life of Dr. Mary Putnam Jacobi, I put a link to the audiobook on Libro.fm in the show notes and on my website. When you purchase your audiobooks from Libro.fm, you can choose a local to you bookstore to support. And when you follow the affiliate link, you also support this podcast. Thanks to publisher Dreamscape Media for the audiobook sample you heard in this episode. And a special thanks to the Colorado Humanities Colorado Book Award for shining a light on great regional artists in my area. Due to the loss of federal funding, Colorado Humanities is now relying on community support to keep their programming strong and preserve the Colorado Center for the Book. I hope you, like me, will become a humanities champion and supporter wherever you are. As always, thanks for listening.